January 9th, 2026, 11:27 a.m. Brussels time. The European Commission announces full operational status for the Emergency Energy Integration Grid, a $340 billion infrastructure system that eliminates European dependence on Russian natural gas for the first time since the 1970s. 12 hours earlier, the final connection point between Spain's renewable capacity and Germany's industrial demand went live, completing a network that delivers baseload power across 27 member states without a single cubic metre of Russian gas. I've analysed energy security policy for 3 decades. I briefed European governments on resource dependency when most officials treated Russian gas as inevitable necessity rather than strategic vulnerability. And what's operational today isn't incremental improvement in energy diversification. It's systematic replacement of 50 years of pipeline dependency with distributed generation and cross-border integration that fundamentally alters European strategic autonomy. Let me show you how Europe ended energy dependence that shaped foreign policy for 2 generations. European dependence on Russian natural gas wasn't accidental. It was deliberate strategy pursued by both sides for distinct but compatible reasons. For Russia, energy exports provided hard currency earnings essential to Soviet and post-Soviet economic survival. For Europe, Russian gas offered abundant supply at competitive prices from a source that appeared politically stable despite Cold War tensions. The infrastructure told the story clearly. Major pipeline systems constructed during the 1970s and 1980s connected Siberian gas fields directly to European consumption centres. The Brotherhood pipeline delivered Russian gas to Central Europe through Ukraine. The Northern Lights system supplied Scandinavia. Yamal Europe transported gas across Belarus and Poland to Germany. By 2020, Russian gas supplied approximately 40% of European consumption, totaling roughly 155 billion cubic metres annually, worth approximately $50 billion at prevailing prices. For some countries, the dependency was near total. Germany imported 55% of its gas from Russia. Italy relied on Russian supplies for 43% of consumption. Austria, Hungary, and several Eastern European members sourced over 80% of their gas from Russian pipelines. This created asymmetric vulnerability that Russia increasingly weaponized for political purposes. During disputes with Ukraine in 2006 and 2009, Russia cut gas supplies during winter, demonstrating capacity to impose costs on European populations through energy disruption. During political tensions over sanctions or NATO expansion, Russian officials would hint at potential supply restrictions, creating implicit threat that shaped European policy decisions. The economic logic appeared compelling despite political risks. Russian gas was cheap, abundant, and delivered through existing infrastructure that required minimal European investment. Alternatives, including liquefied natural gas from Qatar or the United States, required expensive import terminals and remained price uncompetitive. Renewable energy was growing but couldn't provide baseload power on demand. European policymakers accepted this dependency as manageable risk. They calculated that Russia needed European revenue as much as Europe needed Russian gas, creating mutual dependency that reduced likelihood of supply disruption. That calculation held until February 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine eliminated the assumption that economic logic would constrain Russian political decisions. When European governments imposed sanctions on Russia following the invasion, Russian response was immediate and severe. Gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria were cut entirely in April 2022. Flows to Germany through Nord Stream were reduced by 60% by July. By September 2022, Nord Stream pipelines were sabotaged, eliminating that supply route completely. European gas prices spiked to levels 10 times higher than pre-crisis norms. Industrial production slowed as energy-intensive manufacturers faced impossible operating costs. Residential heating bills increased to levels that imposed genuine hardship on working families. The economic and political crisis forced recognition that Russian gas dependency wasn't manageable risk. It was strategic catastrophe waiting to happen. The immediate European response focused on emergency measures to survive winter 2022-2023 without Russian gas. Governments imposed conservation mandates reducing consumption. LNG import terminals were fast-tracked for construction. Coal plants scheduled for closure were kept operational. Nuclear facilities slated for decommissioning received extensions. These measures prevented immediate catastrophe, but couldn't constitute long-term solution. LNG imports were expensive and competed with Asian buyers for limited supply. Coal use conflicted with climate commitments. Conservation couldn't be sustained indefinitely without economic damage. The strategic decision emerged in March 2023 during an emergency European Council meeting where member states agreed to the Emergency Energy Integration Initiative. The concept was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. Build interconnected renewable generation capacity across Europe sufficient to replace Russian gas entirely while creating cross-border transmission infrastructure capable of balancing supply and demand across 27 countries with different consumption patterns and generation profiles. The price tag was staggering. Initial estimates projected $340 billion in investment over 3 years, larger than any infrastructure program in European history. But the alternative, continued vulnerability to Russian energy coercion, was deemed strategically intolerable regardless of cost. The implementation strategy had 3 components operating simultaneously. First, massive expansion of renewable generation capacity, primarily wind and solar. Second, construction of high-voltage transmission lines connecting generation centres to consumption centres across national borders. Third, deployment of grid-scale battery storage to manage the intermittency challenges that made renewables unable to provide reliable baseload power. The timeline was compressed impossibly compared to normal infrastructure development. Traditional European energy projects required 8 to 12 years from planning to operation. The Emergency Energy Integration Initiative demanded completion within 36 months to eliminate Russian dependency before it could be weaponized again. The scale of construction between March 2023 and January 2026 defied conventional project management assumptions. Renewable capacity additions that would normally take a decade were compressed into 3 years through streamlined permitting, guaranteed financing, and industrial mobilization comparable to wartime production. Offshore wind capacity increased by 85 gigawatts across North Sea, Baltic Sea, and Atlantic coast locations. Denmark, Netherlands, and Germany led deployment with massive wind farms that generated power even during winter when solar production declined. The offshore advantage was consistent wind patterns that provided more reliable generation than onshore alternatives. Solar capacity increased by 220 gigawatts, concentrated in southern European countries including Spain, Italy, and Greece. Massive solar farms covering thousands of hectares generated peak power during summer months when air conditioning demand stressed grids most severely. Rooftop solar installations on commercial and residential buildings added distributed generation, reducing transmission requirements. But generation alone didn't solve the problem. Power generated in Spain couldn't supply German industrial demand without transmission infrastructure capable of moving gigawatt-scale electricity across thousands of kilometres. This required high-voltage direct current transmission lines that could transport power efficiently over long distances. The transmission build-out represented an engineering challenge as significant as generation expansion. HVDC lines connecting Iberian Peninsula to France, France to Germany, Germany to Scandinavia, and interconnecting Eastern European members created network effect where surplus generation in any location could serve demand anywhere else. By January 2026, over 12,000 kilometres of new HVDC lines were operational, creating integrated European grid that functioned as single system rather than 27 separate national networks. The storage component solved intermittency that had previously made renewables unable to provide baseload power. Grid-scale battery installations, totaling 180 gigawatt-hours, provided capacity to store surplus generation during high production periods and discharge during low production periods. This eliminated the problem where solar power peaked at midday, but demand peaked in evening, or where wind power varied unpredictably, requiring fossil fuel backup. The financing came from multiple sources coordinated through European Commission frameworks. EU budget contributions provided $120 billion in grants and low-interest loans. Member state governments contributed $140 billion through national programs. Private investment provided remaining $80 billion, attracted by guaranteed power purchase agreements and carbon credit mechanisms. The workforce mobilisation was extraordinary. Over 850,000 workers were employed in renewable installation, transmission construction and storage deployment at peak activity in mid-2024. Training programs graduated electrical engineers, grid technicians and construction specialists at rates 10 times the normal capacity. Chinese equipment manufacturers supplied solar panels and wind turbines at scales that would have been impossible without their production capacity. By December 2025, system testing demonstrated that integrated European grid could meet total electricity demand using only renewable generation plus storage during favourable conditions. Final connection points were completed in early January 2026, enabling full operational status where Russian gas was no longer necessary for electricity generation or industrial processes. The $340 billion investment represents comprehensive cost of achieving Russian gas independence, calculated across generation, transmission, storage, and system integration components based on contracted prices and completed installations. Renewable generation accounts for approximately $195 billion of total investment. Offshore wind farms average $3.2 million per installed megawatt, including turbines, foundations, cabling, and grid connection. Solar installations average $0.9 million per megawatt, including panels, mounting systems, inverters, and connection infrastructure. The 305 gigawatts of new renewable capacity required $195 billion in generations investment. Transmission infrastructure represents $85 billion. HVDC transmission lines average $7 million per kilometre, including towers, conductors, converter stations, and right-of-way acquisition. The 12,000 kilometres of new transmission required $85 billion. Substation upgrades and grid reinforcement added another $15 billion, bringing total transmission investment to $100 billion. Storage deployment accounts for $35 billion. Grid-scale battery installations average 195,000 per megawatt-hour of capacity, including lithium-ion cells, power electronics, cooling systems, and integration hardware. The 180 gigawatt-hours of storage capacity required $35 billion investment. System integration and control infrastructure represents remaining $20 billion. Advanced grid management systems, forecasting software, market coordination platforms, and cybersecurity protection required substantial investment beyond physical infrastructure. These systems enable real-time coordination of generation, transmission, and consumption across 27 member states. The economic comparison to continued Russian gas dependency is revealing. At pre-crisis prices, Russian gas costing approximately $50 billion annually seemed cheaper than $340 billion infrastructure investment, but that calculation ignored strategic costs of vulnerability that became catastrophically visible during 2022-2023 crisis. Industrial shutdowns due to energy shortages cost European economy an estimated $180 billion in lost output during 2022 alone. Residential energy subsidies preventing political crisis from unaffordable heating bills cost governments $95 billion. Emergency LNG purchases at elevated prices exceeded normal Russian gas costs by $140 billion during 2022-2023. The cumulative cost of Russian dependency crisis exceeded $400 billion before emergency infrastructure was even operational. The $340 billion investment that eliminates future vulnerability appears economically rational even before considering strategic autonomy benefits. Russian gas dependency shaped European foreign policy for 50 years. German Ostpolitik prioritized engagement with Russia partly to maintain energy relationships. European reluctance to confront Russian aggression in Georgia 2008 and Crimea 2014 reflected concerns about energy retaliation. NATO expansion debates were constrained by concerns that antagonizing Russia could trigger supply disruptions. Eliminating energy dependency fundamentally alters these strategic calculations. European governments can pursue policies based on values and interests rather than fear of gas cut-offs. Support for Ukraine faces no energy constraint. Sanctions on Russia carry no boomerang effect. NATO expansion proceeds without energy. Blackmail risk. The economic implications extend beyond strategic autonomy. European renewable capacity creates export opportunities for equipment and expertise. German engineering firms develop advanced turbine technology. Spanish companies pioneer solar farm management. Danish specialists lead offshore wind deployment. These capabilities create commercial advantages in global energy transition that generates a revenue replacing fossil fuel imports. The employment impact is substantial. Renewable energy sector created over 500,000 permanent jobs in maintenance, operation and system management beyond the 850,000 temporary construction positions. These jobs are distributed across rural areas where wind farms operate and southern regions where solar generation concentrates, reducing regional inequality that had been politically destabilizing. Most importantly, energy independence eliminates import dependency that drained hundreds of billions from European economy annually. Money previously paid to Russia for gas stays in European economy, funding renewable operations, grid maintenance, and infrastructure upgrades. This import substitution improves trade balances and reduces vulnerability to external price shocks. For Russia, loss of a European gas market represents strategic and economic catastrophe. Energy exports to Europe provided approximately $140 billion annually before crisis, representing roughly 15% of total Russian government revenue. Alternative markets in Asia cannot absorb European volumes at comparable prices. Pipeline infrastructure connecting Siberian fields to European markets cannot be redirected to China or India without massive investment. Russian attempts to replace European customers have failed comprehensively. Power of Siberia 2 pipeline to China remains unfinished due to financing and technical challenges. LNG export expansion faces sanctions limiting access to Western technology. Asian buyers exploit Russian desperation by demanding steep discounts, further reducing revenue. The geopolitical implications reshape European position in global system. Energy independence eliminates vulnerability that constrained European policy for 2 generations. EU can pursue values-based foreign policy without fear of Russian retaliation. This attracts partners globally who see Europe as reliable alternative to both American unpredictability and Chinese coercion. The critical question is whether European energy independence proves durable or whether future developments could restore Russian gas dependency. Multiple factors suggest the transformation is permanent rather than temporary. Infrastructure investments create irreversible path dependencies. Once 340 billion is invested in renewable generation, transmission and storage, that capacity continues operating for 25-30 year design life. Renewable generation has near zero marginal costs. Once built, operating costs are minimal. This makes renewable power economically superior to imported gas, even if gas prices decline to pre-crisis levels. The technological trajectory reinforces rather than undermines renewable advantages. Solar panel costs continue declining through manufacturing improvements. Wind turbine efficiency increases through larger rotors and taller towers. Battery storage costs drop through chemistry innovations and production scale. Each year makes renewables more economically attractive relative to fossil alternatives. Political dynamics prevent reversal. Governments that invested $340 billion in energy independence cannot justify reversing course to restore Russian dependency. Voters who endured crisis wouldn't accept policies recreating vulnerability. The political price of restoring Russian gas imports exceeds any economic benefit. Climate commitments align with energy independence in ways that reinforce both objectives. EU climate targets require eliminating fossil fuel consumption. Renewable capacity built for energy security simultaneously advances climate goals. This creates policy lock-in, where environmental and security objectives mutually support continued renewable expansion. Labour markets reflect permanent shift. Workers trained for renewable sector careers won't return to fossil fuel industries that are contracting. Companies investing in renewable manufacturing and services expect decades of growth. Skills, capital and institutional knowledge accumulate in renewable sector, creating competitive advantages that strengthen over time. Most importantly, the strategic lesson is internalized. European policymakers experience catastrophic costs of energy dependency firsthand. Future generations of officials will remember 2022-2023 crisis as defining moment requiring permanent vigilance against strategic vulnerabilities. This institutional memory prevents casual return to import dependency regardless of short-term cost considerations. January 15th, 2026. European electricity generation achieves 72-hour period operating entirely on renewable power plus storage without any fossil fuel contribution. The milestone was unimaginable 5 years earlier when Russian gas supplied 40% of European energy. Today it represents operational reality that Russian gas is no longer necessary for European economic function. The 36-month transformation from crisis to independence violated every conventional assumption about infrastructure timelines and project complexity. $340 billion in investment compressed decade-long development cycles into 3 years through political will, financial commitment and industrial mobilization that historical parallels compare to wartime production. But the achievement wasn't primarily technical or financial. It was strategic recognition that dependency creates vulnerability no cost savings can justify. When Russia weaponized energy exports to coerce European policy, the calculation changed instantly from gas as cheaper than alternatives to independence as priceless regardless of cost. For Europe, energy independence represents recovered strategic autonomy after 50 years of constrained foreign policy. European governments can now pursue values and interests without fear of Russian energy retaliation. This fundamentally alters European position in global system and creates space for independent policy that American and Chinese alternatives cannot constrain through energy coercion. For Russia, loss of European energy market represents strategic catastrophe without recovery path. The $140 billion in annual export revenue cannot be replaced in alternative markets. Siberian gas fields connected to European pipelines cannot be redirected to Asia without investments. Russia cannot finance under sanctions. The leverage that shaped European policy for 2 generations evaporated in 3 years of emergency infrastructure construction. For global energy markets, European success demonstrates that large-scale renewable transition is technically and economically feasible when political will exists. Other regions watching European independence will draw conclusions about their own import dependencies and strategic vulnerabilities. If Europe can eliminate Russian gas in 3 years, other energy importers can pursue similar strategies. The transformation isn't complete. Natural gas still provides heating and industrial processes where electrification hasn't yet occurred. Some member states remain more dependent than others on fossil imports, but the core achievement is undeniable. Europe can generate electricity and power its economy without Russian gas. And once infrastructure enabling independence is operational, reversing course becomes economically irrational and politically impossible. 50 years of Russian gas dependency ended in 36 months of emergency construction. The infrastructure operates, the strategic vulnerability is eliminated, and European energy security no longer depends on Russian goodwill or pipeline flows across contested territories. That transformation reshapes European foreign policy, Russia's strategic position in global energy markets in ways that will define geopolitics for decades ahead.